My name is Gail Mandel, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Oregon Jewish Museum and Center for Holocaust Education. And on behalf of myself and my colleague, Becca Biggs, our Communications Manager, who's here with me tonight, welcome to Oregon Jewish Voices 2022. Welcome to those of you who are here in person and for those of you who are joining us on Zoom. The Oregon Jewish Museum and Center for Holocaust Education explores the legacy of the Jewish experience in Oregon, teaches the enduring and universal relevance of the Holocaust, and provides opportunities for intercultural conversation. The majority of the museum's programming, including tonight's events and recordings of past events, are offered without charge, and we would be grateful for any contribution or donation you might be able to make to support our programming. You can find information about upcoming programs, exhibitions, membership opportunities, and donations on our website. At present, the museum is open Wednesday through Sunday from 11 to 4. We currently have 2 special exhibitions on view. In the Menashe Gallery is A Century of BB Camp, highlighting the camp's first 100 years of history. And on view in the main gallery is Harley Gaber's Die Plage. Gaber was an American Jewish minimalist composer and visual artist. And the exhibition features his 390 collaged images depicting forces that reconfigured human behavior in Germany from the Weimar Republic through the Holocaust. Now turning to tonight's program, Oregon Jewish Voices owes its 23-year history to Willa Schneberg, who has skillfully organized this event since its inception, and we have want to extend our heartfelt thanks to her. This evening, we will be hearing from 5 talented writers whose work spans a range of genres, including fiction, poetry, nonfiction, and essays. We are grateful to them all for giving their time and sharing their words with us this evening. For those of you who are in person, this evening's authors' books will be on sale in the back of the room once the program is over. If you are watching on Zoom and you're interested in locating and purchasing a book that one of the authors' books tonight, we encourage you to please shop online or visit a local bookstore. The format for this evening is I will introduce each reader. They will come up to the podium and speak for approximately 10 minutes. And at the end, we'll have time for questions. If you're watching online and you have a question, please enter it in the Q&A tab at the base of the Zoom screen. And for those of us in person, we'll just do it the old-fashioned way and raise our hands. So I would now like to introduce our first writer this evening. Bryna Goodman is a professor of modern Chinese history at the University of Oregon. Her books include Native Place, City and Nation, Regional Networks and Identities in Shanghai, Gender in Motion, Divisions of Labor and Cultural Change in Modern China, and 20th Century Colonialism in China, Localities, the Everyday, and the World. Her recent work examines globally circulating institutions and categories of knowledge in modern China, with attention to print, culture, gender, and political life. The Suicide of Miss Xi, Democracy and Disenchantment in the Chinese Republic, was a finalist in nonfiction for the 2022 Oregon Book Awards. Bryna?
Well, it's quite an honor to be here, and I thank the museum for this invitation, and thank you all for coming, and those of you in the Zoom audience as well. I'm going to be reading from The Suicide of Miss Xi. I hope I'm audible. Is that okay? Good. The book begins with suicide, and I'll just start with the introduction. On the evening of September 8, 1922, the body of a 24-year-old female clerk named Xi Shangzhen was found hanging in the office building of the Chinese newspaper, the Journal of Commerce. The building was located in Shanghai's international settlement, the Anglo-American dominated enclave that constituted one territorial authority in a city of multiple and fragmented jurisdictions. A graduate of a progressive girls' school, she had been the first female employee of the newspaper. Prior to her employment at the newspaper, she taught briefly at her alma mater and at another girls' school in the city. She also wrote essays, poetry, and fiction, but published little in her name. The clerk's employer was an influential US-educated businessman in his early 40s named Tang Jiezhi, the managing director of the Journal of Commerce. Prominent in commercial circles, Tang achieved celebrity in the popular nationalist mobilization in Shanghai of the May 4th movement of 1919, in which Chinese protested the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, which transferred German concessions in Shandong province to Japan, circumventing Chinese sovereignty. As the movement subsided, Tang redirected his political acumen and expansive social and commercial ties into the establishment of a progressive newspaper. Under his leadership, the journal achieved acclaim for its critical political voice and comprehensive economic reporting. At a moment when the entrance of women into public life was heralded as a sign of a new democratic era for China, the discovery of Xi's corpse near the window of the office she shared with her employer was certainly inauspicious. Contemporary concern for the sexual integration of workplaces and Tang's reputation for championing social reform, including female employment, ensured that the news reverberated beyond the newspaper office and the social, political, and intellectual circles of both Tang and Xi. Early reports on the matter revealed that Xi's apparent suicide was also linked to a devastating Chinese stock exchange bubble that had engulfed Shanghai in the previous year. Like many in the city, Xi had invested in the market and suffered tremendous losses. In the words of one observer, Xi's mother was heartbroken to think of her lively, lovable daughter dying at a young age as a result of economic oppression. The connection to the recent financial turmoil intensified media attention to the suicide. Indeed, the dynamism of Shanghai newspapers at this moment was itself tied to the financial exuberance of the stock exchanges. Chinese newspapers enjoyed considerable advertising revenue from the sudden rush of stock exchanges that had sprung up in the city, as the cliche had it, like bamboo shoots after a spring rain. A timely subsidy from the most prominent of these exchanges had in fact enabled the opening of Tang's own journal in January 1921, easing financial challenges that had initially appeared insurmountable. Public preoccupation with economic news also stimulated increases in newspaper subscriptions. The combined electricity, or for some, the corrosive radioactivity of links between celebrity and finance, and the eroticization of office space that accompanied the new sexual integration would generate discussion for months in Shanghai's print media, tea houses, offices, and other public venues, activating the pens of Shanghai's literary lights and early members of the nationalist and young communist parties. The discovery of Xi's corpse also set in motion a surprising chain of events. Tang was arrested, placed on trial for financial fraud, and sentenced to prison. Some would see this as Tang's just desert and Xi's cosmic revenge on her tormentor. Such commentators hailed Xi as a new woman and a martyr to the cause of women's independent livelihoods. Others framed her choice to end her life as a regrettable weakness of character, evidence of women's frailty and unsuitability as self-determining citizens. Whereas some writers who called attention to Xi's recent losses on the stock exchange suggested that she had been foolish in her investments and susceptible to the temptations of the market, others described what happened as a crime of capitalism. Still others, Tang's defenders among them, understood the unfolding events quite differently, as a miscarriage of justice and a silencing of public speech, another nail in the coffin of China's early 20th century republic, and a betrayal of the principles of popular sovereignty in their formative moment. The circumstances of Xi's suicide and the events it unleashed are crucial to understanding why and how, for the arbiters of Shanghai society, this suicide so greatly shook public opinion that in the course of the tremendous social furor that ensued, not a pen remained dry. Some facts were quickly established. Others were mysterious, hinted at only in rumors, silences, odd behavior, or peculiar choices of words. Further material, some of it possibly manufactured, was unearthed, attested, and contested in investigations undertaken by journalists, public associations, and the Chinese court in the weeks and months that followed. A preliminary narrative of what happened on the evening of September 8th took shape almost immediately. Shangbao employees customarily ate supper together each evening at 5 p.m. When Xi failed to appear, Wang Jipu, an older member of the staff, dropped by her desk. She explained that she felt ill and had no appetite. Her pallor, and something about her manner worried him. When she brushed off his suggestions that she go home, he left and sent someone to alert her family members. The unmarried She lived with her family on a lane in the old city, the old Chinese city, the formerly walled core of the urban conglomeration that comprised modern Shanghai. To get there from the newspaper office, a person needed to walk south through the grid of streets in the international settlement, traverse the avenues of the French concession, and navigate the dense maze of alleyways that wound through the old city. Not long after Wang sent his underling on this mission, about 6 p.m. She closed the office door, mounted a chair, slipped an electric tea kettle cord through a metal ring near the window, placed her head through the loop, and stepped into the air. She's poised as she balanced on the chair, grasping with both hands the cord on which she would hang herself, is imaginatively portrayed in a woodblock print that was published shortly after her suicide. She's family was eating dinner when the messenger arrived, either because he didn't indicate that the matter was urgent, or perhaps because interactions with She's office were not out of the ordinary for the family. She's sister finished her meal before making her way to the newspaper. When she arrived at the building, not less than an hour later, she found the office door locked, and it was necessary to call for Chen Alio, the gatekeeper, to fetch a key. Chen opened the door and stood aside, revealing She dangling in front of the window frame. Several employees who had gathered in the doorway lifted She's body, loosed the cord from around her neck, and gently laid her down. A Dr. Zhang, who was summoned to the scene from St. Luke's Hospital, pronounced She dead at approximately 8 p.m. Tang Jizhi was not present at the discovery of She's body. Although his newspaper was published in Chinese and staffed almost entirely by Chinese, Tang had a Western partner, a man he had met a few years earlier through their common connections with student activists. According to a police report at the Shanghai Municipal Archives, it was this foreigner, the Russian Jewish American journalist, George Sokolsky, who telephoned the police to report the hanging, a detail that was omitted in published accounts. It may have been that Sokolsky was the highest ranking newspaper employee on the scene. English language letterhead for the journal, which identifies Sokolsky as treasurer, survives in Sokolsky's archived papers at the Hoover Institution on the campus of Stanford University. It may have also been more convenient for Sokolsky, as a Westerner, to place the call to the International Settlement Police than for a Chinese employee. Whatever the reason for his involvement at the scene, however, She's suicide rattled Sokolsky. Thank you.
Our next reader this evening is Seth Lorenci. He is a Portland-based writer whose work focuses on Jewish intergenerational trauma, psychedelics, and healing. He was a co-organizer of this year's Judaism and the Psychedelic Renaissance, a first-of-its-kind live event. Seth's memoir, Fatherland, is slated for publication in late 2023 by Spiral Press Collective. His work also explores his time in the Washington, D.C. punk scene of the 1980s and 90s. His nonfiction has been published in numerous West Coast and national newspapers, magazines, and literary journals, including Moment. Seth?
Thanks, folks. So pleased to be here. There. Okay, good. Yes, the book I've written is called Fatherland. It's true. It will be published next year. It's a memoir and coincidentally a work of nonfiction too. And it's about coming to grips with the scars of the Holocaust through psychedelics. It's a story about waking up in middle age and realizing that the sense of unreality and unbelonging I've always felt might be related to my family and their untold stories. It's about journeying back in time via psychedelics and then journeying here in this plane back to Budapest, where my father was born, to uncover the truth of what really happened to my family during the Second World War. Ultimately, it's a story of triumph and rebirth and acceptance. piece I'm going to read tonight is called The Man on the Corner, and I'm not sure it will remain in the final draft, but it's illustrative, I hope, as to what the book is about. It's about a very early and puzzling introduction to what Jewishness meant in my family. And it helped tell me how my father saw our place in the world. Later, after the police came to our house with their binders full of mugshots, none of them even slightly resembling the man in the corner, it was my father who revealed to me who we really were. Retelling the story for a friend, he reenacted the moment one of the cops radioed in his report. The victim, my father said, playing the role of officer number one and adding a dramatic pause I couldn't recall having actually occurred, is 9 years old. He was right, technically. I was 9 years old in 1980, and I had just been mugged. But what I see now is the deep wellspring of fear animating his words. Good, now you understand who it is we are, what we must protect ourselves from. It told me far more about my place in the world than anything my father ever said to me, or rather didn't say to me, about what it meant to be vulnerable, about what it meant to be Jewish. A few days before, we'd all piled into our bottle green Chevrolet Caprice Classic and driven to the assisted living facility to see Chirka, my Hungarian grandmother. I did not love these visits. Faint static charges crackled between my father and my stepmother, and it was clear she had little interest in her undemonstrative mother-in-law. My own interactions with Chirka consisted of playing my latest piano pieces on the upright in the common room, then awaiting the inevitable negative critique. This time, as the rest of the family said their goodbyes, I went outside to dawdle on the sidewalk. As I stood on the tree-shaded corner in my white button-down Oxford and chinos, a man approached me. There was something jangling out of focus about him, a jitteriness barely held in check. I was not yet experienced enough to recognize what coursed through his veins along with his blood, turning a young man old and giving him a strangely hollow cast. Now he stood before me. His lank, oily hair hung down past his ears. Like me, he wore a button-down shirt, though his was pale blue. Unlike mine, his ended untucked outside his jeans. My grandmother would have a thing or two to say about that, I thought idly. The man wanted to talk with me, but about what I couldn't understand. He spoke quickly but quietly, the words indistinct. I couldn't grasp what he was talking about, and in fact, I couldn't understand any of what was happening, why he was talking to a kid like me in the first place. I didn't notice when his eyes shifted, as they must have, to take in my new watch, an exquisitely dorky black Casio calculator unit. Now he pulled himself together, his tone becoming more pointed. This is where memory snaps back into frame, the soundtrack at last lining up with the projection. I respect you. Do you respect me? He said. Yeah, I replied, ever polite. I mean, on a human level, sure. I don't recall him raising his voice or changing his inflection as he finally revealed the reason for our little chat. I've got a 38 in my back pocket, and if you don't give me that watch, I'll blow your motherfucking head off. This moment, of course, remains in clear, listening focus. Me, the sweating young man, not unhandsome I see now, aquiline nose, finely angled cheekbones, the silent trees overhead. It wasn't exactly fear I felt as I unstrapped my watch and handed it over. I didn't think he would shoot me or that he even had a gun. But the interaction and later my father's reaction to it was a key in the lock. In its aftermath, my softness and essential vulnerability clicked into position like the eyepieces on the optician's machine. Which one is clearer, number one or number two? All of a sudden, the letters were in perfect focus. That was 40 years ago. It's been 25 since my father's been gone. But it's only now that I have some inkling as to why he seemed to approve so perversely of my little life lesson. It came after I started digging into his backstory, the Hungarian childhood he told me so little about. In the 1930s, as the country's orbit drifted ever closer to Nazi Germany's, overt acts of anti-Semitism became more and more tolerated. His classmates' sneers became taunts, then accidental trips and shoves in the hallway. Eventually, his playmates took to pushing him down in the playground dirt day after day, often piling on and pulling down his pants to check if he was still Jewish, the sort of repeated sexual assault he could never bring himself to tell me about. Not in words, at least, but there were other ways, like how the walls of my childhood home were lined with thousands of books about the Holocaust, war, dislocation, and trauma. But among all these stories of tragedy and loss, one was conspicuously absent, our own. No one ever told me what happened to those missing family members, the aunts and uncles and cousins and grandparents who were taken away to places like Mauthausen and Auschwitz or nameless forests in Transylvania or Ukraine, never to be seen again. How when my own inevitable rushes to schoolyard bullies came, my father went strangely silent, never once allowing a sliver of emotion to break the placid surface of his face. No, what happened between me and the man on the corner was a teachable moment, excusing my father from having to do it himself. Having been hunted since childhood, he still believed we were being chased and that it would never end. Could we turn to face it? Could things ever just be okay? I never got an answer. We are surviving was all my family of survivors could muster in response. We are surviving. We are surviving. We are surviving.
Thank you, Seth. Our next reader this evening is Vivian Papero. Her poems have appeared in Clackamas Literary Review, Timberline Review, Cirque, Rain Magazine, The Poeming Pigeon, and other publications. She received second place in the 2021 Kay Snow Award for Poetry by Willamette Writers. Even. Her dream landscape is Provence, southern France, but she considers the Pacific Northwest her home. Her collection, A Nest in the Heart, was published this year. Vivian?
Thank you all so much. What an honor to be here. Thank you to the museum. Thank you to Willa. I'm going to keep my mask on tonight. We're traveling to see our daughter in Washington tomorrow, and she has a health condition that requires us to be very cautious around her. So I will do my best to project and make sure that you can all hear me. So, in her moving poem, In Memory of Crossing the Columbia, Elizabeth Woody writes of her mother and the Columbia River. She gave me her eyes and the warmth of basalt, the vertebrae of her back, my breastplate, the sturdy belly of the mountainside. Elizabeth Woody's poetry prompted me to ask, where is my body's landscape? Where does my body belong in the natural geographical world? My book, A Nest in the Heart, is my attempt to start to answer that question for myself and my family. My family journeyed across one sea, one ocean, and 3 continents. And as Roger Cohen wrote in the New York Times, trees have roots, Jews have legs. Displacement is hard. A new land is also the loss of the old. With this framework in mind, I'm honored to share with you a selection of my poems from A Nest in the Heart. First is conversing with my mother's father in the afterworld. I never knew my grandparents, so I try to imagine, what would I say to them when I meet them in the future? I know some Yiddish, he knows some English. We both know the sound of a kettle boiling. I offer my grandfather lemons and strawberry jam for his tea. He chooses a sugar cube, holds it between his teeth, sucks his tea through the sweet strainer. I tell him chocolate. I tell him mint. Somewhere in his old country, snow is falling. Somewhere in his old country, heavy black shoes trudge through deep snow. I tell him green. I tell him puddles. I tell him rain. I tell him matted leaves, loam. I tell him mud, Douglas fir, hemlock, spruce, pine. He tells me honor. He tells me security. He tells me hard work. He tells me gentleness. He tells me 20 years growing corn on that flat, dusty African plain were the happiest of his life. Next is a poem called Winter 1919, Lithuania. This is based on a story handed down, a family story. I smile, I arch my brows, I glance sidelong, I swirl my hips, I twirl, I place my hands at my waist. I see the soldier stop raking the fireplace with his rifle. I see him push his cap to the back of his head, sling his rifle over his shoulder, extract tobacco and thin white papers from an inside pocket, lick his lips before his pink tongue seals the cigarette shut. I see him grin, watch me slip my thumbs inside my waistband over the elastic of my mother's flannel bloomers beneath my wide skirt, tap my feet, click my heels, to mask the faint clack of silver knives, forks, spoons, 2 candlesticks wrapped in a soft white cloth, snug inside my mother's bloomers under my wide petticoats. I burst into song. We sing in the sun as we plow the black earth. I clap, yodel. The soldier joins in, conducts, cigarette between index finger and thumb. Smoke and shards of tobacco scatter. He throws the cigarette butt on the rug. We watch a black hole slowly widen. He stares at each of us, purses his lips, spits, walks out. I keep singing. My mother, back to the wall, waits. 2 more verses. She stamps out the embers on the rug, turns her pale face to me. I reach under my skirt, pull off the baggy flannel bloomers, wrap them around their silver burden, hand them to her, singing. South Africa, 1925. A refugee from Lithuania reflects on her new life. It was hard at the shop. I couldn't really speak English or Afrikaans. Maurice tried to teach me. The children tried to teach me. Say, good morning, not good morgen. They laughed and ran away. I understood the quiet pointing and gestures of Black people better. They pointed. How much? I would hold up 3 fingers, put the bottle of cooking oil in a basket, nod my head to take a bag of cornmeal. They slipped their battered pennies into my hand. My fingertips brushed their calloused palms. We lowered our heads to each other. Sometimes I included a few boiled sweets with the change, smiled at the ragged children clutching skirts, bright-eyed babies tucked tightly on their mothers' backs. The steely blue stare of the white Afrikaner farmer's wife pulled me back behind the counter. Good morning. Palms flat on the polished wooden surface. I leaned forward, smiled. Next poem is called Ritual. My sister says she remembers seeing our grandfather recite his morning prayers. She sat in the low blue velvet armchair, swinging her short legs. She stared up at him as he swayed back and forth, his lips opening and closing, releasing scratchy whispers into the early morning sunshine. I think I saw my brother pray, or maybe it's a photo I remember. He wound black leather straps around his left arm and across his forehead, so that the little black boxes containing the special Hebrew words were tied close to his heart and as frontlets between his eyes. I didn't know what frontlets were until I searched in the dictionary, a decorative band or ornament worn on the forehead. Girls could mouth the words, but never bind them next to their hearts with soft leather or as frontlets between their eyes. Maybe that's why my father, his voice icy quiet, ordered me to remove the narrow ribbon patterned with flowers twisted around my forehead, holding down my curly black hair. Just in case you think my father was not a kind man, I'm going to read you the next poem, which is called Yortzeit. It's my father's Yortzeit, anniversary of his death, according to the Jewish lunar calendar. In 3 houses, spaced across this continent, my siblings and I light special candles, wax in a glass, remembrance. We swapped stories, questions, tears, sometimes laughter. Remember how we kept vigil at his bedside. How the night before he died, he sat up and said, "I can only take you this far." When I was little, he swung me up and settled me on his shoulders. I remember his warm hands holding my ankles, the smell of vitalis as I wrapped my arms around his forehead. I remember the wind in my curls, how different the world looked from my high perch, scary, yet how safe. The sure swing of his gait moving forward. "Dad," I whispered, "you carried us over continents for decades. You still do." My last poem for this evening is called Land, Land and Body. My crib was pink wood, my blanket soft white, but my bed was inside a long swaying sling, moving from continent to continent, rocked by the rhythms of trains, steamships, and airplanes. The rocky spine of the poppy, with its narrow, dusty, twisting paths behind our house, called to me, but I could not stay. Women in dark rooms, cold continents away, cooking, sewing, cleaning, gave me their dark eyes, their thin lips, their tight curling hair. The broken threads of their lives quivered in heat waves, rising of dusty paths, empty asphalt roads. The ether of their lives reformed and settled in me. Now, my back rests in the soft black loam of the Willamette Valley. My belly fills with sweet blueberries from Hillsborough, peaches from Dayton. My skin blooms to the sun's rays. My blood rushes with the gray sluice of rain. Here I conceived and birthed a daughter. She swam through my heart and my heritage. She grew and left this green and cloudy place, but returns with the seasons for celebrations. The past tendrils twist through her, twist through me, curl through her, and hold us tight. Thank you again to the Jewish Museum.
Our next writer speaking this evening is Michael Shine. Michael wrote Liquid Perishable Hazardous, which is poetry. John Surratt, the Lincoln Assassin Who Got Away, which is historical. The Killer Poet's Guide to Immortality by A.B. Bard, which is hysterical. And historical novels Bones Beneath Our Feet and Just Deceits. He edited Poets Unite, the Lit Fuse anthology. His poetry appears in many journals and has been nominated for a Pushcart 3 times. He is the founder of Lit Fuse Poets Workshop and has taught at Port Townsend Writers Conference, Right on the Sound, and elsewhere. Michael?
Thank you so much. And I'm not going to read any poetry because that was just so great. I follow that. Is that good? Can you all hear? I feel like the light entertainment. I'm going to read from Just Deceits, a historical courtroom mystery, which is basically based on the celebrity trial of the 18th century. And there's nothing really Jewish in here other than, you know, I wanted to be a writer. And my folks, my mom is here. My mom managed to get me to be a lawyer first. So then I became a lawyer who writes. And so this was when I was teaching American legal history, reading dry biographies of John Marshall, I stumbled across this tale and wanted to know more. In the 1790s, the Randolphs were the wealthiest and most powerful family in Virginia. But there was a scandal when young Richard Randolph was accused of having an affair with his wife's sister, Nancy. And they were charged with the crime of infanticide, the murder of the infant, allegedly to cover it up. However, being wealthy and powerful, they were able to get the best. They were represented by Patrick Henry, the Revolutionary War hero, and by this young lawyer by the name of John Marshall, who many of you will know later went on to become Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court for some 34 years, and remembered as the great Chief Justice. What you need to know to dip into this novel is that Henry and Marshall were not getting along. They were quarreling over tactics. Henry was thriving on theatrics while Marshall was relying on logic and preparation. That the estate where Richard Randolph, Nancy Randolph, and his wife Judith Randolph, and this ne'er-do-well brother Jack Randolph all lived was known as Bazaar Estate, and that's true. And this is near the end of the first day of the trial. John Marshall has just finished cross-examining Mrs. Brett Randolph, a cousin who said that Nancy looked pregnant to her, and he's doing a lousy job of it. No further questions. Well, I have a further question, if you don't mind, announced Henry, rising. Marshall gave him a look calculated to sour milk, but Henry was not affected. Mrs. Randolph, began Henry, but he was cut short. Objection, cried Marshall. You can't object to me, protested Henry. We're on the same side. And with a wink to the crowd, he added disparagingly, at least I know I am. Gentlemen, said Judge Allen, I will give you 1 minute to whisper between yourselves and solve this problem. The court will not permit 2 attorneys to cross-examine the same witness. Henry and Marshall huddled. She stayed at Bazaar after the carriage left that morning, whispered Henry. Why? I bet it was to dally with Jack, who also stayed. We have no proof of that, snapped Marshall. Who needs proof? Suggested, and she is discredited. Never. She hurt us badly, Marshall, and you barely scratched her. Her husband is old enough to be her father. She often visited without him, and when the carriage pulled out, that left Mrs. Randolph alone with a gentleman just her age. It's enough to create doubts. Marshall looked at Henry, puzzled that such a satyr could be so successful in life and law, and so well liked to boot. She has told the truth as best she can, fairly to both sides. I will not impeach her with innuendo. Your Honor, said Henry, rising, I have important questions about why the witness who constantly visits the Tsar without her husband would have stayed behind with Jack Randolph last October, but objection, screamed the prosecutor, but it was too late. The poison was out of the bottle. Mrs. Randolph turned bright red, her eyes searching the crowd, first for her husband, who looked grim, then for Jack, who grinned back at her. Counsel approached the bench, barked Judge Allen. They did so. The judge leaned over as far as he could towards Henry. Governor, he said, you're too old and well respected to spend time in jail for contempt. That means I may have to have you shot. He was joking, but he wasn't smiling. So after that, Marshall heads out, kind of bewildered as to how this day didn't go the way he expected. And he's grabbed by Jack Randolph and taken off through the wild carnival that's gathered on the village green to a gouging contest, which is a historically accurate. Imagine a wrestling match in which the object is to gouge out your opponent's eye, and everything is legal, as they announce. So by the time Marshall gets back to his inn, he's really confused and finds Patrick Henry has taken a spot at the inn. So, said Henry, refusing to let Marshall sulk, how'd we do today? How did we do today, thought Marshall, honestly now. You did a nice job with Mr. Harrison and Mr. Page, I'll give you that much. How did you know that Mr. Page dances with his sister-in-law? I didn't. You didn't? You mean to say you risked an entire line of examination on pure chance? Henry chuckled. No, Mr. Marshall, nothing so irresponsible as that. It simply did not matter whether he dances with his sister-in-law or not. Either he does, which means he engages in the same sort of, quote, imprudent familiarities with which he accuses our clients, or he doesn't, in which case he's too much of a stuffed shirt to tell an imprudent familiarity from a handshake. He was doomed just for being himself. Didn't matter what he answered. Well, that was all right, I suppose, said Marshall, unsure now whether it was or not. But the rest of your behavior today, unspeakable. Whatever do you mean, Mr. Marshall? What do I mean? Can you be so blind? By the standards of the mob, I'd say you did quite well with Mrs. Brett Randolph. But by the standards of law and the code of behavior attendant upon the high office of attorney, not to mention gentleman, I'd say that you performed shamefully. Well, the next time we have a jury made up of angels and gentlemen, I'll change my tactics. But as long as they're drawn from the mob, as you call it, I'll stick with what I know to be effective. Is it effective, countered Marshall, through a mouthful of leathery meat? Or do you merely furnish a moment's entertainment, forgotten as soon as it's finished? Oh, I've given them something to think about, replied Henry. They'll think long and hard about what Mrs. Brett Randolph was doing at Bazaar with Jack Randolph. And in doing so, they will not be thinking about her testimony against our clients, which is the last thing in the world that I want them to think about. But it's disgraceful, said Marshall. You have no basis for smearing Mrs. Randolph's name. Mr. Marshall, said Henry, trying to contain his annoyance, you may have noticed that Mrs. Randolph was a very credible witness, and that your logical examination did little to undermine that credibility. At the end of it, what we had was the simple testimony that Richard paid more attention to Nancy than his own wife, and Nancy looked pregnant. People do not hold too many things in their mind at once, present company accepted, and they may always be counted on to prefer salacious innuendo over the simple facts. While you may consider that to be disgraceful, it is nonetheless the way the world works. You know little of the case, replied Marshall. Mrs. Brett Randolph's testimony cannot withstand logical analysis during final argument. You know little of human nature, responded Henry. If you let such testimony go without serious challenge, final argument may be too late. But what of the pure ethics of the thing? This is not a game of cricket, Marshall. It's more like that gouging contest out there. Everything is legal. Marshall pushed his plate away, his appetite lost. I cannot believe that. We do not need to tear out the witness's heart in order to expose the logical fallacies of the prosecution's case. Henry looked down his nose at this earnest young man. And what if there are no logical fallacies? What if our esteemed clients are simply guilty as hell? What then, counselor, prodded Henry. Marshall pushed with his tongue at a stray piece of gristle stuck between his front teeth, but he couldn't get it free. What then, indeed?
Thank you, Michael. And our final reader for this evening is Willa Schneberg. Willa is a poet, an essayist, visual artist, curator, and a psychotherapist in private practice. She has authored 5 poetry collections, including In the Margins of the World, a recipient of the Oregon Book Award, and her latest volume, Rending the Garment. Willa co-founded with OJMCHE's director Judy Margles, Oregon Jewish Voices, now in its 23rd year. Among the journals in which her poems have recently appeared or will appear are Salmagundi, Poet Lore, Bellevue Literary Review, Minyan and Tikkun. A new collection of poems relating to mental health called The Naked Room is forthcoming in January of 2023. Willa?
Thank you for lowering it, some of the shorter people around here. I can't believe that this is the 23rd annual reading of Oregon Jewish Voices. And then after a 2-year hiatus, when the event was exclusively on Zoom, we are now again meeting in person. So it really is wonderful to actually see you in front of me. And with the addition of Zoom, though, we have expanded our audience nationally and internationally. I know last year someone Zoomed in from Patagonia. So, you know, I see the advantage of both. So to me, this is a wonderful merging, especially with some folks who said they're going to be here tonight, but then with a terrible air quality. So thank you so much for making it here. I want to give special thanks to Judy Margles, to Gail Mandel, to Amber Corson, who's the tech person who's doing the Zoom. She's somewhere right in there, right? To Becca Biggs, who is helping us with books tonight, and Debbie Jane, who without their support and expertise, this event would not be happening. I will be reading poems from my new collection that's forthcoming in January, The Naked Room. And as Gail said, they do relate to mental health. The poem that I'm going to start with is entitled American History. And it was recently published in Tikkun. If people are not familiar with Tikkun, it's a progressive Jewish journal. And they also recently started a podcast, so I had the pleasure of reading this poem. The Tikkun poetry editor, Francis Payne Adler, is in the Zoom audience. American History. Dr. Thind made history fighting to be Aryan. He was also my husband's godfather. Thind and his wife watched Robin at 4 while his mother was in labor. Soon his sister's head would crest between her legs. United States versus Bhagat Singh Thind went all the way to the Supreme Court. We're continuing with the justice approach here. The justices agreed that although Thind was technically a member of the Caucasian race, he was not Caucasian in the popular sense of the word, so thus deemed not white. His citizenship was immediately revoked, and it became un-American for all South Asians, including Robin's grandfather, Vashnu Das Bhagai, to be naturalized or categorized as a free white person. Vashnu's right to carry an American passport or own Bagai's bazaar on Fillmore, which he had scrimped to establish, was dissolved like words on a wet piece of paper, and his reason to wear a three-piece suit obliterated. He booked a room in San Jose and wrote to his wife, Carla, "Well, dear, I have to leave you," and turned on the gas. I was raised with the phrase, "No Negroes, Jews, or dogs allowed," warning me that I shouldn't get too comfortable. Robin and I are comfortable together. Our hands often find the other, and when we sleep at night, we spoon. Just wanted to tell you a positive end to this prose poem is in Berkeley, if any of you have a chance to go there. Vashnu's wife was Kala Bagai, who lived, and that's how Robin is in the world, and continued very much on with her life after the suicide. And there is now a street named after her called Kala Bagai Way. So if you're ever in Berkeley, check it out. The next poem I'm going to read to you is called Iron Lung. And it was inspired by my uncle, Brod Gellerman, who had polio. Jokingly, we called him the Jewish FDR. Iron Lung, and this is in the voice of my aunt. I often write persona poems. Iron Lung. If he could stand up, he'd look like a spaceman in comics, his head sticking out a porthole. But my husband, who never spent a night not holding me, except when he was deployed, cannot. He's stricken. He puckers his lips to kiss me. I bend over and my lips barely raise his. I want to coat his face with wet kisses, not in front of the other wives or their men, each in his own metal tank. Dr. Sol's vaccine talk means nothing. Will the only man I ever loved be able to ravish me? When I give Sadie the robin's egg blue blanket with the frayed satin and her stuffed mohair deer, the crying stops. But during some visit so deep in myself, her fussing doesn't register. Everyone tries to comfort me. He will breathe on his own, but not, he'll walk again. I won't leave his side. Attendants pull me and the other bereft brides off our broken men. Nurses force us to walk back to apartments with shiny appliances that give no comfort. I'm expecting. Sadie rubs my tummy and pleads, no baby, puppy. The next one is a found poem, which you can think of like the Duchamp's toilet. If you call it a poem, it's a poem, right? So it's the same idea. This found poem was discovered at the Oregon State Hospital Museum's display board. Has any of you been to Oregon State Hospital Museum? It's pretty interesting. Oh, you have. It actually has One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, all about it. You know, it's pretty fascinating. Causes for admittance to Oregon State Insane Asylum, 1906. Brain softening, childbed fever, Christian Science, disappointment in love, general debility, that means physical weakness, if you don't happen to know what that means. I had to look it up. Idiocy, lead poisoning, masturbation, menopause, nervous frustration, overstudy, puerperal trouble, which means the timer about 6 weeks after childbirth. But what we know now, it probably was postpartum depression, right? Removal of ovaries, spiritualism, suppressed eruption. I think you know what that one is. I don't know if to tell you what that means. Tobacco, worry, 1906. This is another poem which I will end with, and we look forward to hearing your questions. And it's so wonderful to try to imagine who's on Zoom, because we can't see them, but we know you're there. So we want to get your questions as well as those in the audience. There is now a monument at the Oregon State Hospital Museum of copper canisters holding the unclaimed cremains of those who died at the hospital. Patients were cremated from 1914 to 1973. Tiny monuments, and the epigraph reads, for David Mizell, who photographed canisters holding the ashes of mental patients at Oregon State Hospital. If you haven't seen those images, they're out of this world of the way the canisters oxidize. Tiny monuments. When human beings were still locked away, for sadness clinging like a marine layer, voices saying how awful they are, going fetal when cars backfire or corks pop. They were housed at the Oregon State Insane Asylum, and when they ceased to be, they were cremated. If no one claimed a brother, a daughter, or a father, the ashes were kept in numbered copper canisters on pine shelves in an underground vault. Not infrequently, the water table rose, giving the forgotten homes uniquely their own, coated with effervescence and mineral dazzle, where an alchemy of copper and water bloomed and burst into color. These tiny monuments to the scorned and unknown, where patinas of pink, burnt sienna, ochre, aqua, and if you look closely, you will find moon craters, archipelagos, frozen waterfalls, big dippers, and dunes with lone tracks. Thank you.
Okay, we are going to get started with our Q&A session. So if you could bear with us 1 second. Becca's going to bring a cordless mic around. I'm going to shift the camera.
A question for Seth. Hi, Seth. I was struck by your connections between trauma and psychedelics, but of course, we didn't hear much about that in your little talk. And I'm aware that there are several companies now doing actual formal clinical trials with psychedelics for people who have PTSD. And I'm just curious if you had any
personal experience with this, or if you can speak to how you came to that connection in your writing.
Well, I don't have personal experience with the companies doing that work. I don't think that's what you mean. As you may know, next year here in Oregon, there will be what are called psilocybin service centers where people will be able to get treatment using that medicine. The way it came to me, or I came to it, was that my marriage was falling apart. And my wife and I went to see a therapist to ease the process of separation. And after a few sessions that were more or less standard, the therapist suggested, would you like to try one under the influence of MDMA? And having nothing to lose, we said yes. We're still married. And our lives look very, very different than we did then. Of course, this was a few years ago now, and the therapist is in legal jeopardy doing that work underground. That has changed somewhat. Measure 110, which passed a couple of years ago, makes these medicines, well, actually, and you can't get arrested for anything here in Oregon, except after a certain limit. But my point is that there are many people doing this work underground. It will sort of erupt into the mainstream soon. And there's so many different vectors, access different medicines for different reasons. Does that not answer your question? I feel like it doesn't.
No, it does. It does. Thank you.
It's a start. Yeah, thanks for asking.
Any other questions? Let me bear with me. I think there is a question in the chat. Technical difficulties.
Oh, I see another
Anyone?
question.
Oh, great.
I was wondering about your concept of being a Jewish writer when you're not writing about Jewish things. Like, how do you feel your Jewishness plays into your writing when you're not writing about it?
When I started this, I decided that it would only be, people would have to decide within themselves how they define their relationship with Jewish identity, so that it would be a very individual thing. I've had 1 year, someone convinced me that he lived in New York, he had a strong relationship with Jews, and he felt Jewish. Whatever that means. So I think that we can talk about I don't believe one has to write about Jewish subjects, and that's the other thing. I don't feel that anyone must feel ghettoized in that way. But I think your question is important. Does that inform your writing, no matter what you're writing about? And I think in my case, the fact that I came from a background of everyone in my family had survived the Holocaust, but there was still this strong sense of Jewish oppression. For example, my mother was very aware of the quotas for Jews going to college. She was the first woman in the family to go to college. And so I do think for me, it informed my sense of writing about social justice in general. Not only, I lived for a year in Cambodia and wrote about the killing fields. So I think there's a sense for me that that's part of how I define myself as being Jewish. Other people?
Well, I think I think you can certainly write about things that don't have an evident Jewish theme, but I do think that certainly for me, it's certainly part of my identity and in the way in which I engage with the world, whether I like it or not. I don't think that growing up I had a strong sense of oppression, the kind of thing that Willa mentioned. But I think it's very hard you can't really disentangle who you are from what you write, I think. But you can write about things other than being Jewish. It's just how you approach it, I suppose.
As the guy who read something that had nothing to do with being Jewish, to me, there was a strong sense of absolute free inquiry and opportunity to challenge anything that I was raised with that helped lead to some of the things I've been able to create as a creative writer. Maybe my most quote Jewish book, if there is one, is Bones Beneath Our Feet, which I didn't read from and I only have one copy of. And it's about the Puget Sound Indian War of 1855 to 56 and the native story. And, you know, basically an empathy with any oppressed people.
Yeah, I think about the family that I was raised in, as I mentioned in the piece I wrote, that there were many books on the Holocaust and Judaism in the house, but because of my father's peculiar experience, well, his experience wasn't peculiar, maybe how he metabolized it was. We didn't really identify as Jewish. I mean, it was something that was semi-acknowledged, sort of slipped out in strange and uncomfortable ways. So I guess what my question is, given how distant I've always felt from Jewishness, I wonder if someone could read something I'd written and identify me as Jewish, even if it weren't about Jewish topics.
This is a hard but very interesting question for me because I don't write about Jewish topics. And my whole career going to China, in a way, was going very far away as my family understood me. But there are themes, that is, pressed to answer this question. I could say that there are themes that drew me to particular topics, not self-consciously, but my first book was about sojourning and identity, native place identity. It was in China, but that's in a way a Jewish theme. There are people who would say that the stock market themes in my current book have something in them of my father, though I didn't conceive it that way. And because there is this strange character, George Sokolsky, who I paid particular attention to. He's kind of in some ways, a marginal figure in my story about China. But there are people whose lives run through Shanghai, and at various points, I've had some connections to these interesting Jewish travelers in the city and some of their histories. So it's indirect, but I think it's there.
Thank you. Okay, so we have a question coming in via Zoom. Individuals interested in knowing what each of you are currently reading. And especially they're curious if there are any young Jewish writers, whether it be regionally, nationally, or internationally, whose work you would recommend.
Start?
Well, my answer has nothing to do with young Jewish writers. I'm afraid I'm reading Salka Valkon by an Icelandic writer and a Chinese novel about the stock exchange, which I'm trying to translate.
Oh boy, I have a lot of books on my nightstand right now. I do not seek out Jewish writers in particular, but there's one book I'm reading right now, which is a weird kind of analog to what I've written, to Fatherland, because this writer's named Nick Barley. He's a few years older than me. He has a very parallel story. He's an English writer. He's a Guardian columnist, I think, a novelist mostly, a great writer. But he's written about his Hungarian Jewish family, and the resonances are eerie. His great uncle was an artilleryman in the First World War in the mountains, as was my grandfather. They may have known each other. Weird resonances like the name of his father's best friend growing up in a Budapest apartment. Just little things, sometimes significant seeming, sometimes not. But where he's really gone into the deep family history, I've been following advice of early readers and going into my history, because that's the thread. Like, for me, what are these stories? How do these stories manifest now in the present day, rather than what these people were doing a century ago? It's all interesting to me, but just a different approach. Again, not really answering the question, but taking a stab at it.
One of the novelists that I adore is Alison Krauss. You know her book, The History of Love. Anyone read it? I mean, it's just out of this world. I mean, it's just like, I just didn't want to stop reading it. You know, there's a very, I'll show you, here it is, Willa Schneberg kind of character, this old man who I just totally fell in love with. He was just like the most adorable person. Anyway, it's sort of a story in a story. It just really breaks your heart. Each character is so, I can see people shaking their heads, for those who can't see people, you know, this an adolescent, about how it's all about love in all these other ways. A very important Jewish poet to me over the years is Edward Hirsch. If you don't know his work, he, as well as being an amazing poet, and I would say he does write about the Jewish experience. He also writes books about how to enter poetry, and he even has this amazing book of glossary, a glossary of poetic terms. It is kind of like my Bible, and I just love it. And what I'm reading at the moment is by a local author, Casey Parks, Memoir of a Misfit, Diary of a Misfit. Does anyone know that book? Yeah. You're reading it right now too? Yeah. And it's just a most fascinating story. And for those of you who get the Times, it was featured in a book review about a month or so ago, but she does live here. And it's basically her coming of age as a lesbian, but also her looking at her grandmother's generation as a woman who lived as a man before trans was a term. So it's just fascinating.
For poetry, Ilya Kaminsky, I would recommend, who is a Ukrainian Jewish American, wonderful poet, dancing in Odessa, and more recently, Deaf Nation, which is an important, very important book of poetry for anybody who is concerned with our militarism in the world. And Anthony Doerr recently read Cloud Cuckoo Land, which is very informative for you know, the sacking of Constantinople by those hordes out there. Well, some of it you get the story from the other side, from the horde side, and you learn of their humanity as well. And it's beautifully wrought. So that would be a book I'd recommend. Not for, this is for adults, not adults.
Boy, those are all wonderful recommendations. I would add Carolyn Forche's most recent book of poetry. And of course, I can't remember the name of it, but it's her most recent one, which I've read and keep going back to. I also enjoy just finding, you know, there's a lot of wonderful women poets, And that's what I've been trying to find, is Ellen Bass, we just read. And then she's a wonderful one. And then, of course, Sharon Olds was just talked about in the New York Times. So there are a lot of wonderful women poets that one can find. I mean, right now, the books I'm reading are more like, I just read Monuments Men for my book group. And I'm reading The Man Who Walked Through Time, which is a book about the Grand Canyon, walking from, instead of going rim to rim, it's walking east to west or west to east. Okay. But yeah, Ilya Kaminsky, Carolyn Forshane. Thanks.
Does anyone any other questions here in the room? Okay, there are two more that are on Zoom. One is for all of you to respond. One is for Bryna. So I think we'll do, if Bryna could answer this one question, and then we can wrap up with another question for you all. Bryna, what is the story behind how you came to be curious about and write about Miss She?
Well, when I was writing my first book, this one about Chinese sojourners in the city of Shanghai, that I was interested in organizations of people from different areas in China that had their association in Shanghai. So people from Guangdong or people from Sichuan, Suzhou, they each had a meeting place, and the heads of their associations kind of adjudicated issues in their community and dealt with issues that arose with other Chinese groups in the city. And while I was working on that book, I encountered this mention of this suicide case and the legal case that arose from it in the records of two different native place associations, because the man, Tang, was from Guangdong and the woman, Shi, was from Suzhou. And both of their associations got very involved in the legal scene. I could see that. And it's a very complicated case. And I thought I could use it for that book, but I just couldn't figure it out. There were many things I couldn't figure out about it. So I kind of just put it aside. There's nothing I was going to do with it at the time. And then years went by, and I was doing something else entirely, and I found a reference to this case, to her suicide, an article written about it by the Chinese translator of the Communist Manifesto, one of the first organizers of the Chinese Communist Party, who is not from either of those places. And I thought, why did he write about her suicide? And I had just had my son, and I was trying to figure out how to survive in academics with a little son. I had other things to do, so I needed a quick research project that I thought at the time that I could get a grant to go to China for, where it would be easier to find a nanny and childcare and do my research again. So, so I began to look when I saw this communist had written about this suicide case. I just looked in the newspapers from the time, and I suddenly realized that this case was not just a matter between the Suzhou and Guangdong communities, but it had been an enormous social scandal and legal case in the city because of some of the social activism of the man involved in his social profile, and also the importance of the new woman as a figure for change and social transformation in China at the time. So I began to trace it through the newspapers, and that led me to many other sources. So it was a really long, slow unfolding project. It just happened that I came upon other threads. I was a graduate student at Stanford, and it just happened that I looked, when I was having a hard time doing other things, this was after I was done being a graduate student, I periodically would return to Stanford and go through some of the paper collections at the Hoover Institution, and I found the papers of George Sokolsky, which took me into the case from a completely different side. And then at various times, other sources became open. I mean, many of these are sources that are no longer at archives that are open in China because everything has closed up. But I did have access to the Shanghai Municipal Police files in Shanghai. And so I could trace it through police records. There were other records. So gradually I became possessed with just trying to figure out the mysteries of the case. And that it stuck with me until I began to think that I could understand it well enough and could figure out how to tell the story. It's the challenge of it.
Thank you. Okay, so one final question. It's kind of a big one. So I'd say try to be as concise as you think you can. We have about 5 minutes left. But the question is, someone's interested in understanding more about your writing process. Would you consider it more structured or more spontaneous?
Yes.
That's concise.
I had to know, right? Big questions about writing. I would not say spontaneous at this point, or would I say exactly structured. That is, I never know quite what will happen, and then of course, even when I have something down, I keep reworking it. So this was a very long project in the writing, and pieces moved and changed, and sometimes I would just think of something and it would take me in another direction.
Well, you and I were chatting a little bit before the presentation, and I'm not sure if I said this or just thought it, but obviously psychedelics play a big role in my book and in my life. And I'm not a Terence McKenna acolyte, but he said a lot of things that interest me. One of them is talking about what he calls the psychedelic perspective, which, among other things, is a willingness to accept and even seek out ambiguous or fractal or illogical inputs. And for me, that's what spontaneity is. There is rigor and there's structure, but there's also knowing that information and inspiration come from the least expected places at the least expected times.
I agree that this is, I could say too much about this, so I will try to rope myself in. What I've noticed that I've done over the years is my books have become more thematic. When I was younger, the poems just sort of came together and I said, oh, okay, now it's a book. But the way I do it now is, I think starting with my book on Cambodia, you know, it was thematic, and I moved through, because I do, you know, write narrative poetry, and the book that's coming out about relating to mental health has chapter headings that like the 50-minute hour or termination. If you know, there's a terrible term, but it's like the last session when you go into a therapist, it's called termination. I don't know, awful. Anyway, so, but what I, you know, realized that that structure really helps me. But the flip side of, you know, being a writer is the business of getting it in the world. And as a poet, it's ridiculous, right? Because who wants poetry anyway? But I find that each time I send it out, I revise. I use it as an opportunity to make the work stronger. So there is a positive element of what I call the poet is, moving it from just that inspiration place, that first draft, to the revision, and then the next one, and then the next one.
Yeah, I've written a lot of different genres, from pure history to historical novels to poetry. Inspiration is very important to me, and I think I can credit to that my lack of success. So, you know, in the business, if you're very disciplined, you can, build even poetry collections around a theme, which is what publishers seem to want. I hate that. I think it was Marianne Moore says, I don't write books, I write poems. And poems, God, they just come from, not just the sky, but the grass and the shit that lands on you and the stuff you step in and everything like that. And so how can you not react to it? And I think a lot of the most wonderful writing comes from that, which is not to say there isn't a whole world of discipline, but mostly it's from just reading a lot and being open.
Yeah, I agree. Reading a lot and being open. I am lucky enough to be retired, and so I can take my time, read a lot of poetry, meet with other poets, hear what they have to say about the poetry we're reading, and get the inspiration from there. The discipline does come in through trying to you want to get your words out in the world. And as Willis says, you keep submitting, and every time you submit, every time there's a rejection, you look at the poem and maybe resubmit in a different way, in a different light. So I would say, to sum up, the process takes both. It takes both inspiration and it takes some structure as well.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you to our fabulous colleague, Amber Person, who's behind the scenes running tech. Willa mentioned her earlier, but this wouldn't be possible without her. And we're thrilled that you all came out tonight. Thank you.